Thoughts podcast. Today we're very, very lucky, as one of our special guests is to have Gary Rogers, who's a very, very experienced investigator. So Gary, welcome to our Inspiring Thoughts podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, mate. So I'm very humbled.
Yeah, no, really, really great to have it. I know you've got a very, very busy schedule, so it's great to have you kind of part of the podcast today. So, Gary's been given questions like all our guests, 7 questions in advance, so that he can get time to prepare, and then we can actually glean that rich knowledge from Gary, kind of to share with us. So, Gary, before we get into that, would you mind just sharing with our audience your kind of career history or your career path? That'd be wonderful.
That'll probably take up quite a bit of your podcast, mate.
Well, I was going to say we've only got 50 minutes, so we'll see how we go.
So I actually checked this. So in February this year, I passed 35 years doing investigation work.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so I started. I've started in private security, and then I did a spell in a government civil service doing fraud investigation work and surveillance work. Spent a very short time in policing, and then spent the remainder of my career working for Transport for London, where I sort of led and then eventually restructured and managed about 250 internal investigators and external fraud investigators looking at serious staff misconduct, bullying. I was a dedicated bullying and harassment investigator, chairing numerous disciplinary areas, and unfortunately attended court, both magistrates and criminal and employment tribunals, more times than I really want to recall. So that's it. That's me.
Another thing there. So you've seen a lot in your time. Probably a silly question, but I'm smiling to myself. What made you get into investigations?
Do you know what? Honestly, I left school, no qualifications, and I sort of started working the building trade. So around the late 80s, it sort of fell apart, and then I suddenly realised I probably should have gone to school because now I can't do anything. So I fell into security work, and then from then I just found I had this, I don't know, this interest, aptitude for finding and identifying areas of misconduct. So I actually started as part of what used to be called test purchasers or mystery shoppers. I used to go into organisations, just pretend to be a mystery shopper and watch them and see if they were basically back in that day, stealing from the till. And it just sort of progressed from there. I just sort of found out it was interesting. I just carried on. Each time I went on a different bit of training, I was progressed into another department. But I'll be honest with you, Steve, I actually tried to leave after a short spell in policing. I got a little bit disillusioned with constantly dealing with grief, to be honest. And I actually went to Transport for London, believe it or not, to be a conductor on a bus.
Right.
Yeah. And I went for this job, and they said, no, you don't want to do that. Not with your background. Let's move you into this field. And that's how I ended up still going into it. So, yeah, but I still find it interesting. And yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, and one thing that I noticed from LinkedIn and your profile, you're constantly learning and developing and going on courses still, etc. I see that quite a lot from your development. What makes you do that?
I've had this conversation a couple of times this week actually already, and I'm not naive enough to think that despite my experience I know everything, because you don't. There's a lot of people out there who probably like to think they do, but you know what, we don't know everything. People never cease to surprise me on what they will do or not do. So I'm constantly sort of exploring different aspects of investigation work, particularly in this ever evolving world of tech, social media and stuff like that. So I'm sort of constantly trying to keep myself updated.
Yeah, and I'm a great believer about being current. And a lot of people say to me, I'll just do my job and I'll do that for the rest of my life. That's okay, but people will overtake you in your career unless you stay current and keep enhancing your skills. You'll get left behind, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, don't think you know everything. And I've done, I've recently, as you said, I do a lot. So I've recently just, updated myself on a lot of the ACAS stuff because, legislation changes, technology changes, as I said, and people change. You look at, younger generation, I don't want to be this, but when you come from a certain generation and you've experienced certain things, the new generation have a different perspective on things.
Yeah.
So keeping yourself updated on that, I think, is really important. The changing landscape of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's fantastic, and I think one of the bits where you and I have worked together before about just keep learning, it's great. I think it's great to keep learning from that aspect.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, so to take it back to the kind of nuts and bolts of the beginning, what is an investigation? What's the part of it, or what is an investigation?
In simple terms, it's a fact-finding exercise. That's it. That's really breaking it down. We like to overcomplicate. You're there to establish facts. You're there to find facts, and you do that in a multitude of ways. You conduct interviews with people. You're gathering information, documentary information. So it's just a fact-finding exercise. It's just establishing. When someone comes forward and says this took place, it doesn't matter what it is, really. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm not happy. This is what's happened, and I want this looked into. As an investigator, you're that independent voice, that objective voice, that voice of reasoning that says, okay, I'm going to conduct this fact-finding exercise. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's I like the couple of words that you said there about fact-based evidence, which is really rather than opinion-based, because that's where a lot of these kind of investigations or grievances, people are based on opinion. And the other bit there is you are only just gathering information through the investigation, aren't you? You're not judge or jury or hearing manager. You're just gathering that detail to then supply to other people, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a common mistake I find, and I'm sure you might ask me that, but a common mistake is, yes, you're absolutely right. You are, as an investigator, you're there just to gather the facts, and then you're providing an outcome based on those facts, that evidence, and nothing more. It's evidence based, not emotionally based.
Yeah. And there is high emotion, isn't it? During an investigation, extremely high emotion, and a good investigator is to try to take that emotion back, isn't it? And hold it back to just see the evidence and the facts rather than opinion, etc., and also get caught up in it.
Yeah, no, which is easy to do, by the way. It's easy to sit here and say, don't let your own emotions influence your decision-making process during an investigation. It's easy for people to say, and I think it's the really experienced professional investigators that are able to do that well, and that's understanding your own bias as well as the bias of the people that you're speaking to, and keeping that in check. I've said on a number of occasions, I am a massive believer in peer review. If you feel that's the case, always, seek advice from others to say, look, am I on the right track here? Does this seem reasonable? Yeah.
And that's the same in the mediation, that you're going to have your own bias, you have your own thoughts and all that kind of stuff. But how do you keep it in check to remain impartial and actually there for the benefit of the colleagues, because that's what you're there for, rather than have your own way or opinion or an agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And what would you say are the key skills to you've worked with a lot of investigators, and I know from your experience, what would you say if you could pinpoint the key traits or skills? What's a really good investigator do or behave?
A couple of things, really. The first one, as we've already just discussed, is maintaining your impartiality, being objective, just looking at what is before you. There's a saying that in investigations, and that's follow the evidence, not the emotion. And that's what you're doing. You're following the evidence. So being very impartial. I think also you need to have really good people skills, and I'm talking about communication here, because you're going to be interviewing a hell of a lot of people in some cases, and as you mentioned earlier, so there's a lot of emotion, because believe it or not, these people, irrespective of what you find as an investigator, their truth is the truth, and that's it. And they're going to be very emotionally invested in telling you what that's all about and why they're unhappy. And you have to really be a good people person to take on board there's what they're saying, not sympathize, empathize, but not sympathize with them, understand their situation and their emotions and recognize it, but making sure that you're keeping that in check. And for me, interviewing people in that scenario is very difficult, and that's a key skill for an investigator. And the other thing is being methodical. You've really got to go through the information with a keen eye for detail, because it could be that one little piece that you're just scanning through that you just think that's not important. Actually, it could hold the key to the whole investigation. So I think if I try, there's loads more I could probably go on about forever, but
Yeah.
those three I think are the key ones. I'm,
Yeah.
as you know, a massive, massive fan and advocate of really good interviewing techniques,
Yeah.
because we see all too often, particularly in the press, about how the way an investigation has been handled and the way witnesses have been handled can lead to in criminal cases like false confessions, but actually that could end an employer in an employment tribunal, and
Yeah.
which is nobody wants. So
Yeah.
yeah, they're the key things for me.
And just to pick up on the phrase there about empathy, not sympathy, is a really kind of, and people struggle with that because they think, I want to rescue that person, I want to share, I've gone through this experience, so they then become part of the investigation, or from that point of view. Whereas the empathy gives that person that breathing space and respect to, it's their agenda, not the investigator's agenda, isn't it? I find that for me, in mediation, investigations, etc., once people can connect with that, it makes their lives a lot easier, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we're going to have those life experiences. So,
Yeah.
for example, if you're interviewing someone or you're speaking to someone who's alleged they've been bullied, and
Yeah.
you've experienced that yourself, of course you're gonna
Yeah.
connect with that situation. And that's what we were saying about earlier. This for me, it is a key skill to understand your own bias.
Yeah.
I think you in mediation, I think you call it hooks and triggers.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what you've got to be looking out for. You've got to think, hang on, this may be something I'm going to connect to, and you just pause, just take
Yeah.
that second to reflect a little bit, and then, okay, not get drawn
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. And what would you say of like the key training that people would go through, or what training to be a good investigator would you say is really kind of great to have? Because you're not going to just go from day one and go, I'm going to be an investigator. What would you say to set people up to win would do?
I think you've got to look around, Stephen. I think you've got to decide what type of investigation or
Yeah.
investigator you're going to be,
Yeah.
because it is very different. So obviously, from my experience, when I first started training, there wasn't really a great deal of external training providers for
Yeah.
investigations. It's all done very much in house. So my initial training, really through various roles, was internally. Now there are so many good providers out there, and I think what you've got to look for, irrespective of which area of investigation you're going to focus on, I think you've got one of the key things you want to be looking at, as I've mentioned, is understanding how to structure and plan an investigation.
Yeah.
Really good interviewing techniques and real
Yeah.
detailed knowledge, and then how to compile all of that and produce this evidence-based findings.
Yeah.
There are some very good providers out there. I personally, my personal training was all in-house until I went in,
Yeah.
then at TFL. I went through. I did, because I was doing fraud investigations, so I went through the City of London Police, because they're obviously the leading
Yeah.
law enforcement organisation for fraud investigation. I did my training through them. And then, workplace investigations, you just got to follow the ACAS guidance. But I do think you know, it's bespoke to what you want to focus on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the bit I found is every investigation is different, but the field that you want to go into investigate, it's not just one size fits all. You've got
No.
different investigation skills, different clients you come across, so they're all in different like sectors or markets to specialize in, isn't it? You can't just do one and you'll be okay with everyone, if that makes sense.
No. I mean, I do say that having conducted sort of criminal investigations, and,
Yeah.
and having conducted, employment or workplace
Yeah.
investigations, the core principles are the same. The core
Yeah.
principles are the same. You plan it and you're interviewing, but you're absolutely right. There are unique little differences, burden of proof being one.
Yeah.
And also your interview style tends to be more open with workplace investigations. When you start going down criminal, you've got evidence there to support it, and you're trying to support the evidence. Although
Yeah.
the interview techniques are exactly the same, it's just a different approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think that if you can just get the basics right, it's like any job you
Yeah.
do, the basics, the foundations, they're the key
Yeah.
things you need to
Yeah.
focus on. Yeah.
And then the also the other bit is about doing the conversations with the clients, following the evidence, as you said, and then it's the compiling of the report as well to make sure it stands up.
Yeah.
And that's also in people's training to think about how to write good reports. It's not all the just good work at the beginning. It's how do you bring it together and articulate it? It stands up kind of the test of time, isn't it, as well?
Absolutely. Do you know what? This is an interesting point, because you can do a fantastic investigation,
Yeah.
and then you can put this report together, and the person who it's intended for, the audience are reading it and they go, I've got a clue what this person's
Yeah.
saying, and it can just completely destroy all that great work you've done. So
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. Making sure that you've got your report down, your report writing skills down to a fine art is key, because actually my personal approach is, whenever I'm sort of making my findings, I'm directing them to where that evidence is that supports what I'm saying
Yeah.
in my report, and I do that a lot. And I think a lot of people fail to do that. You're absolutely right. You've got to be able to articulate what you're trying,
Yeah.
what you've done, because remember, the audience, they haven't got a clue what you've done. They don't
Yeah.
really know what the investigation they don't
Yeah.
just want to read a report and say, well, just tell
Yeah.
me what happened, and now you've come to it. But as an investigator, well, you're
Yeah.
actually, you're so embedded in it, you think
Yeah.
people know what you're talking about, but they obviously don't. So
Yeah.
yeah, your report is, it's almost like, it's like it's like your magnus opus, and it's your last little bit that says, this is the
Yeah.
result of all my great work.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the bit where I think, to echo about people when they're looking at training providers, courses, etc. The people skills, soft skills, investigation skills, those kind of things, really, really important. But the report writing is the thing that brings it all together to kind of stand the test of time, isn't it?
Yeah, the report is actually bringing it all to life, and that's what it's doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Now, one thing, so I love a good like murder mystery on TV and crime, and I really like it. So it's one of my passions. Um, what's I see a lot, and I know you and I have spoken before. What's the balance of probability? What does that mean for people? Because I hear it a lot of people go, "What's the balance of probability?" And what does that actually mean in investigation world? And this is probably
I
more
do.
for me rather than the audience, so I can
No,
understand the crime programs.
do you know what? A lot of investigators struggle with the balance of
Yeah,
probabilities. You see, the burden of proof is really easy in it. The evidence says it did happen,
yeah,
and if it doesn't, then that's it. You can't, prove your case. Balance of probabilities, I talk a lot about in my training, as you know, and the simple way of understanding balance of probabilities. Does the evidence suggest that it is more likely than not the event took place? That's it. That's the simplest way of understanding it. So you hear a lot of people talking about he said, she said, and
yeah,
if that's the case, it's they can't prove anything. Actually, that's not true. It's not true, because you may have supporting evidence from witnesses that say, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, but actually I know that I've heard that person say something like that before, or I've
yeah,
seen that person with that person acting in that way before, and suddenly it's like building a picture.
yeah,
So as an investigator, you're pulling all this information together, and you're saying, okay, with everything I've got here, is
yeah,
it reasonable for me to think that actually, although no one saw it and no one heard it, this probably did happen
yeah,
based on all this supporting evidence?
yeah,
And that's where I find, I'll be honest with you, Steve, I find I've done this recently with a client. I run a session, and I gave them a scenario, and very similar to what I've just said. And I said, so on a balance of probability, do you think there's a case to answer? And they went, no, no. And I was like, well, how have you reached that conclusion? There's not enough evidence. I said, okay, but you've got all these people that are saying they've heard things, they've seen things,
Yeah.
and you don't think on the balance of probabilities this is more likely not to happen. No, we think it's unconclusive or inconclusive.
Yeah.
I was like, so basically you're saying there's no case. And they went, no, we let the disciplinary panel decide that. Okay, so a disciplinary panel, as an investigator, you're saying it's inconclusive. As a disciplinary panel, you think they're going to say, oh, well, we're just going to run to a disciplinary, even though the investigation didn't
Yeah.
conclude anything. I know that was a bit of a long-winded example, but it gives you a
Yeah.
context of how the balance of probability is actually a very important part of
Yeah.
workplace investigations. And
Yeah.
you need to understand it, because worst case scenario, you're doing the investigation, you say there's no evidence and that's it. That means potentially you have an individual, a colleague in your organisation that thinks, great, I've got away with this. I can continue behaving
Yeah.
in this way.
Yeah.
So for me, it's an important part. My long-winded
Yeah.
way of saying that's the easiest approach. Yeah. Is
No,
it more likely not to have occurred?
yeah, and I think putting it into that context of, is it more likely to have happened or not, and how have you based upon that? So have other actions been happening or been seen that you can bring together to
Yeah.
demonstrate? So that makes it easier now for when I watch my crime program. So I appreciate that, Gary, for me being selfish as well. So what are the main areas, not to break confidentiality or anything like, what are the main areas that you're asked to investigate? So if I took in the last 5, 6, 7 months, what would you like main labels or topics you've been asked to investigate?
I'll be honest, Steve, it's very unfortunate, but definitely in the last 6 months, I've been asked to investigate a number of serious allegations of sexual assault and sexual harassment.
Really?
Um, uh, and also, I'm seeing more very detailed, complex grievances being raised against very, very senior management. And I am talking here the C-suite of management,
Yeah.
talking CEOs, directors, partners in some organizations. So unfortunately, yeah, that tends to be what I'm seeing at the moment,
Yeah.
which is quite disturbing when you consider the context of, a lot what's going on in the world today about this,
Yeah.
about women in particular feeling safe, and actually feeling vulnerable. And we have all these allegations at the moment. And I would say I've conducted at least 5 or 6 in the last 6 months.
Really?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and are people happier? Not happier, that's not the right word, but more confident to come forward with their concerns and issues. If I took in today rather than probably in the past, would you have seen more people want to get things resolved rather than just brushing it under the carpet before?
Yeah. I think that would be fair. Not as confident as perhaps we would like them to be,
Yeah.
but more confident than they were. And I think that's a cultural thing. I think, back in my days, of starting early in a career, there was this culture of, I'll be honest, misogyny,
Yeah.
and bullying.
Yeah.
The old phrase JFDI,
Yeah.
that type of approach to things, and treating, particularly females in a workplace like they were just secretaries and they didn't have any
Yeah.
input or value in the organisation. I saw that a lot. I think now is a cultural shift, which is a really good thing, where now those people are speaking up, they're coming
Yeah.
forward. I'm not so sure that they're confident that their concerns are treated seriously,
Yeah.
as much as they should be. I think sometimes it's difficult when you're saying to somebody that there isn't any
Yeah.
evidence at all that would support the allegations, but what you do see is just this really poor management style
Yeah.
of leaders in particular. And
Yeah.
that's a common thing for me in my recommendations. Is every time I've looked at these investigations, I've identified that actually there's no investment in people, and there's no
Yeah.
investment in their leaders in terms of how to manage people, but also how to behave, and the values of the organisation. So yeah, I think there is, but certainly not enough. Not enough.
Yeah. And I think you've fallen into the next question there, which is about what would you say are the main things that could do to prevent investigations, or what could help to alleviate getting to that position? What do you think could help or support?
I think organisations investing in their people. You
Yeah,
know, from the first initial stage of recruitment into a position,
yeah,
and giving them the support and the training and the mentorship and the coaching to excel in their role and work beyond. I think it was Branson said, was it train your people well enough so they can leave, but treat them well enough so that they'll stay.
yeah,
It's a Branson quote, and I think that's a key thing. I think that's a really good quote,
yeah,
because I think that's what people need to do. Because as I said earlier, every time I see there's no investment in people. I think, you know, the other key thing is this: encouraging people to actually speak up.
yeah,
Speak up, call it out. You know,
yeah,
I've just done some training, online training with Susie Lampley Trust, who I'm a big fan of, and you know, it's about, you know, this active bystander.
yeah,
Yeah, and you know, you intervene when you see these things, or you call it out when you see it, and you can
yeah,
do that in a safe way. And I think that's people need to be having conversations. Actually, I think that's what needs to take place. When you see something wrong, call it out,
yeah,
because we both agree, I know, that investigation as a formal process is a destructive process. It
yeah,
ruins relationships. It starts to make this them and us
yeah,
approach. And no matter what happens, one of those parties, if not both of those parties involved, are going to be unhappy about an outcome of an investigation. No matter how, but actually, if they'd have spoken in the first place, if they'd aired it when it first became a
yeah,
problem and tried to resolve it, maybe we wouldn't be in a position where we're having to go this formal route. So,
yeah,
investment in people and actually talking, calling
yeah.
it out.
And it's I think 2020 the CIPD did a paper saying in conflict and that line managers 50% of the time make situations worse. Um, and it's not because they're doing it maliciously, it's because they're not trained, they're
Mm,
not skilled. They're kind of read this document and then you can have a go at an investigation or do that. So, but it makes it worse and creates more chaos
mm,
rather than, I think I also saw through ACAS or the OECD saying 2.4 million colleagues, new managers a year are untrained.
mm.
So actually organizations are setting themselves up to fail and those colleagues by not giving the correct training or just giving them the support to be in a better position rather than causing the problems. And they're not doing it maliciously, they're just not trained to do it, if that makes sense.
No, that sounds reasonable to me. As I said, when I do investigations, that's what I find. Managers not really. You know what? I've used a phrase, and it's not meant to be detrimental at all, but I've done some investigations recently, and what I've said is I find an element of professional immaturity.
Yeah,
And what I mean by that is that people are being elevated into very senior positions
yeah,
with no mature process of going through their career, no support, no mentor, no coaching,
yeah,
no training. So they're elevated to these positions and expected to undertake these things, but they're in their career, they're not mature enough, they haven't gone through that process to be
yeah,
able to manage certain situations. So that to me, you know,
yeah,
I just sounds fundamental. And as I say, people just not speaking to one another.
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think the other bit you said there about active bystander, we should call it out. We should be
Mm,
able to say about other people's behaviour. And I've seen definitely from if you took generation uh, X, Y, Z coming out, they're calling more out, which is great because they're saying
mm,
I'm not putting up with that and I'm not tolerating that behaviour. Whereas I'm talking to my generation, you kind of go, oh, I just ignore it and they won't pick on me or anything like. Whereas now we should have the confidence to go, that's unacceptable behaviour, because then that'll create that bit of we're all in it together rather than that poor person that's getting bullied or had a go at, etc., feeling by
yeah.
themselves, isn't it?
Yeah. That we know from our own experiences that when people are bullied, the first thing they feel is isolated. That's it. First reaction, isolated, then they feel like they're being victimized, and all these things start to escalate. And actually, if someone was to stand up and call it out, as we just said, I'm sure they would feel like, well, actually, no, I'm supported here. It's not just
yeah,
me thinking this. This is something that others have seen. Just,
yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
a big fan of that as well, actually. Yeah.
Now, the next question is where I get my big Braveheart speech, and I'm so passionate about um, revolutionising like grievance, bullying, harassment policies, all those kind of things, because they drive people into that investigation or kind of that approach. What's your view around like restorative policies or restorative frameworks? What's your view from those?
Yeah. Again, I think we need to change culture in organisations, and
Yeah,
I think to a degree of individuals,
yeah,
because the formal process is a default.
yeah,
Now, I'm not saying that in certain circumstances, based on my own experiences, and
yeah.
history, that there are certain circumstances that absolutely they do need to be investigated,
Yes.
whether it be because there's a regulatory breach or there is a potential criminal act
Yeah,
taking
yeah,
place or whatever, or they're very serious in nature. I'm not disputing that. Not
yeah,
disputing that. But as we've just discussed, it led in, if people get into this early discussion, calling it out, trying to resolve it, just through being humans, we should be able to sit down and have a
yeah,
conversation and say, look, I wasn't particularly happy the way we treated me there, because the individual who's doing it may not necessarily know
yeah,
that they're coming across in that way, because it's all about perception, isn't it?
yeah,
So I'm a fan of restorative processes. I think we should be encouraging organisations to follow this route. I think there should be a process where the first port call. Do you know what? I'm going to say something I never thought I'd say. In my 20 years at TFL, the one good thing about their policy was the first line was, have the individual sat down and tried to resolve this informally. That
yeah,
was the first line.
yeah,
And that was like, 1999 I started there. So, if they can see it,
yeah,
why can't everybody? Why can't anyone else? Why can't all the other organisations, big or small? So restorative approaches, restorative frameworks, whatever you want to call them, this informal resolution
yeah,
approach as being the default rather
yeah,
than the formal approach being a default, I think will create my personal view is it just creates a little bit more trust in the organisation and gives people a little bit of ownership even,
yeah,
because you've got the ownership. Well, have you had a discussion? Sit down, have a chat with them. If you need someone to sit in, let's sit
yeah.
in with them. Let's facilitate it, whatever. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's my it's the way forward,
No,
I hope.
and I agree. A lot of people, I think, get misunderstand about early resolution, and they all think, oh, it's really tree huggy, and we get rid of the formal stuff, and it's not. The
No.
formal process is still there because, as you said, there are still serious issues. There are stuff of regulatory breaches. They need to be formally investigated
Hmm.
from that point of view. But what it's trying to say from the early resolution policies is everything doesn't have to go that formal route, which colleagues that I've spoken to over the years, 9 times out of 10, don't want to go that formal route.
No.
But it's the policies say that's the route you have to go.
Yep.
So they automatically go into it, then it causes chaos, harm, destruction to them and their families. Whereas it's just trying to go, actually, there's a better route for those colleagues through a kind of restorative framework or a positive dialogue framework, those kind of things. There's other routes that are available that are better. It saves the company money. It's better well-being, inclusivity. There's loads of benefits, but organisations are being brave enough to change from the 90s policies to a more modern policy, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's my Braveheart speech
No,
on
mate,
that one.
you've got me. Um, yeah, I think, it was we started the conversation about, individually, what do we do, keep updated, and we move with the times. Horrible phrase, but we move with the
Yeah,
times.
yeah,
And unfortunately, I think that's part of the problem with organisations with this. They're not moving with the times. Look,
yeah,
why are we stuck in this process? Why are we stuck? And you're absolutely right. You know, people will just do what the policy says, you know. And
Yes.
I've had people who go, "Do you want to raise a grievance?" No, I just want to. Yep. And you've got the person from the organisation, the person who they've approached, whether it's HR or their line manager or whoever, they're saying, "Well, actually, the policy says you have, you know, if you're not going to raise a
Yeah.
grievance, if it's not in writing, I can't do anything about it." I mean,
Yeah.
have you ever heard such nonsense in today's age? If you
Yeah.
don't put it in writing, I can't do anything about it. What? Well, that's like,
Yeah.
you know, I always say that's guilty knowledge.
Yes.
I've told you, you've got to do something about it. It's your responsibility. Come on.
Yeah.
No, otherwise that person's going to go away and go, "Oh, well, that was a waste of time." And
Yeah.
that situation is going to continue, perpetuate.
Yeah.
And then eventually you're however many months or years down the line, and suddenly they've come to you and they've got a whole host of evidence. And say, "Now I'm raising a grievance." You think,
Yeah.
goodness, if only I had have that down at the beginning, I'd have
Yeah.
stopped all this nonsense.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's a bit of it. Then the person then starts to gather evidence over time. Whereas before, at the beginning bit, is I just want to sort this out. You know, I'm not
Yeah.
sleeping well at night. I want to talk it through. But then people, and I've seen many times where, do a grievance, and that's the policy. You go, but actually, what they wanted to do is have a chat, and then we create that kind of beast or that mechanism, which is awful to go through. So yeah, no, I think we're definitely aligned on that, Gary. So the last question, because I know you and I can talk to the kind of all day long. I know you do a lot of self-development and that, but what are you working on in 2023 for Gary?
Well, in all honesty, I'm just still going through updating myself on all the ACAS changes to legislation. So I'm still working
Yeah.
my way through that. And believe it or not, I'm now considering. I don't come from a HR. I always start my conversation with, because most of the work I do comes from HR professionals, and the first thing I say to them is, "I'm not a HR professional. I'm an
Yeah.
investigator. That's what I do." But I realise now that maybe, you know, it's time for me to sort of get some basic HR foundation working. So I'm looking at doing some HR courses through CIPD actually, just to get some
Yeah.
understanding of their role, because I think that leads me on actually, because one of the things I do think is I think HR get a bit of a rough ride
Yeah.
at times. You know, they're accused of a lot of things, and some of it's very unjust. They're there to support people. And I've seen quite a lot of posts around, you know, HR conducting investigations, and I think HR themselves would probably say this as well. People have lost an understanding of what HR do, which is they're only
Yeah.
there to support them. The investigator actually shouldn't be HR, in my personal view. It
Yeah.
should be an independent, and HR are there to support them or lead them
Yeah.
through the policies and the colleagues in the
Yeah.
organisation. So for me, it's like I'm going to be looking at that this year.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because I've got this soft spot for HR colleagues, because I think they're like piggy in the middle, that they didn't choose to come into the HR world to fight fires or
Mm,
issues, or that they come into the world to help people, support, coach, develop, strategic, those kind of things. But we're seeing through probably policies, leadership, etc., they're getting caught up in that kind of destructive work rather than the
mm,
constructive work, which they
yeah,
wanted to get into. So
yeah,
I'm
totally.
definitely. I think you and I are in agreement with that.
Yeah, definitely, mate. Absolutely.
Excellent. So, Gary, I just want to say a massive thank you for being one of our guests today. How can people get hold of you, or kind of ask any more questions? What's the best way for
Oh,
people to reach out to you?
I'm a LinkedIn monster. So
Yeah,
so if you want to DM me on LinkedIn,
yeah,
I'll be more than happy. As you know, we're going through some restructuring in our organisation at the moment, which is exciting stuff for us,
yeah,
and it'll all be coming out within the next week or so. So I'd just drop
yeah,
me a line on LinkedIn, mate. Why not?
yeah. Wonderful. So, thank you ever so much, Gary
Brilliant.
Rogers, for joining our Inspiring Thoughts podcast today. And I hope you have a really great day ahead, Gary. But thank you ever so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
It's an honour, mate, and look after yourself.
Thank you, Gary.
See you, mate.